So it started as another beautiful December day in Orlando, 72 degrees and sunny, when I got the call. It was a college friend, Ginger. She had been one of the cheerleaders, a young wife of one of my best friends, Bob, my roommate senior year of college, one of the guys that I had played on the basketball team with for the entire 4 years. And she was surprisingly composed as she said, "Dan, Bob is dead, and I want you to do his funeral." Bob and Ginger had started their lives together, pastoring a church just outside of Columbus, Ohio. And Bob was just a great guy, a lot of fun to be around, personable, and just a quality individual. I secretly had always been jealous of his eyes. Everybody noticed Bob's eyes, and his 4-year-old daughter clearly had gotten those stunning eyes from her dad. But that phone call was so difficult to hear. Bob had, even though he'd been an athlete, he had been diagnosed with cardiomyopathy in his early 20s. The cardiologist had adjusted his medication to half of what it had been. 2 days later, he died at age 26. And his daughter, Jordan, 4 years old, found him sleeping on the bathroom floor in their home. To this day, about 300 funerals later, that is still the most difficult funeral, most difficult memorial service that I've ever done in my life. It was difficult because Bob was a close friend. He and another one of my friends, 3 of us all on the basketball team, every year we would make our picks, the NCAA tournament picks together. And we had created a homemade traveling trophy. It was incredibly ugly. And so every year we would, if you won, then you got to keep the trophy for that year. And our wives would not so secretly root against us winning, because that would be a year that the trophy would be at someone else's house. It was a difficult funeral because he was that close friend. It was also difficult because my heart was broken for Ginger and for Jordan. At 4 years old, you shouldn't lose your dad. It just shouldn't be like that. But there was another reason that it was tough. And that was because Bob was a Christian leader, a man of integrity, and tremendous character, all kinds of potential. And at 26, snuffed out. And I couldn't make sense of that. I couldn't. I didn't understand it. I spoke at the funeral, and lots of people said great things about the message. It was a pretty good funeral message, mostly because I stole a lot of the ideas from one of my mentors. But I really wasn't okay with what had happened. I will always have engraved in my mind this one picture, seeing Jordan walk across the frozen cemetery, wrapped up in a winter coat, all by herself. Her dad wasn't with her, and he never would be this side of the grave. I will never forget that. I can't forget that. So many questions, so much loss. I've had a handful of times, occasions in my life when it felt like that. Have you ever had a time when you had that same kind of an experience? Unanswered questions, tremendous loss. Have you ever experienced a time like that? If you have, you don't forget it. I'm curious, how many of you would say that you have walked through the death of someone close to you, or a divorce, or a failed career, or a large financial loss, the loss of a treasured relationship, a season of tremendous loss. Would you raise your hand if you've walked through something like that? Yeah. It's most of us. Aren't you glad you came to church tonight so that I could remind you of all that and just kind of cheer you up, give you an encouraging message this evening? We'll come back to Bob's story in a little while. But if you're new to Suncrest, you should know that this summer we are teaching our way through one book of the Scriptures. It's the book of Acts. And along with that, we're reading during the week on our own, we're reading 5 books of the New Testament that are directly connected to what's happening in the book of Acts. The book of Acts describes the original church. When the church got started about 1,985 years ago, a medical doctor named Luke wrote down what was taking place, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And so we've been talking about that every weekend, and we've been reading Luke's documentary in our quiet times. And if you've fallen behind on your reading, let me suggest that you re-engage. Maybe just start, so it's not overwhelming, start at Acts 1 and pick up from there with us and move forward the rest of the way through the summer. Last week, Greg talked about the growing pains the church experienced as things started off in not a good way, but in a great way for the original. Jerusalem Christian Church began with a core group of 120 men and women. Opening day, 3,000 people believed in Jesus and expressed their faith by being baptized. During the first few months, we're told that more people were added to the church every day. Every day. Within weeks, the church included 5,000 men, that was the count, plus women and children. It was probably about 20,000 people. It was exciting, exponential growth. The established powers, political and religious, started taking notice. You couldn't help but notice this phenomenal movement of God. So rising opposition came to bear against the church. Leaders were arrested and threatened and roughed up a bit. But still, Luke tells us, more and more men and women believed in the Lord and were added to their number. It wasn't slowing down. Last week, Greg described growing pains inside of the church, and there was also pushback from outside the church. But this was a great start. It was inspiring. The followers of Jesus must have been stoked. Peter and John and James and Mary and the rest of the core group debriefed every night saying, Jesus told us the Spirit would come and that great things would happen. It's just like Jesus said it would be. People are being healed. People are taking care of each other in dynamic ways. Widows and orphans have the necessities. Prostitutes and priests are finding forgiveness in Jesus. Life change is breaking out every day. Dozens and hundreds of people accepting Jesus as their leader and forgiver every week. This is incredible. And something else great was happening. Peter and John, the old guard, were leading well, and new leaders were being raised up. This thing wasn't going to end anytime soon. New blood, new leaders just kept taking it up a notch. People from all levels of the culture were coming to Jesus. Stephen was the brightest rising star. I'm not sure that anyone in the Scriptures gets a more glowing description than Stephen. Listen to the way Luke describes Stephen. He's called a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit, a man full of God's grace and power, a man with such Spirit-prompted wisdom that the opposition couldn't stand against him. He's even described as having a face like an angel. I mean, are you kidding me? No bad word is spoken of Stephen, not a single bad word. As far as God and the people of God were concerned, he was an amazing man. But because he was an amazing man, and because he was a powerful up-and-coming leader, he became a target for this rising opposition. Ironically, members of a gathering called the Synagogue of the Freedmen decided that Stephen had to go. They slandered him, and they persuaded the Sanhedrin, the most powerful Jewish authority, that Stephen was an enemy of Moses an enemy of God, an enemy of the law of God and of the temple of God. They said he is a blasphemer. Now let me ask you, do those accusations sound familiar to you? Who else was accused of those crimes? Yeah, Jesus. If you're familiar with the specifics surrounding the arrest and the trials and the execution of Jesus, you're going to notice that Stephen's story is almost identical. False witnesses testify before the Sanhedrin, before this high court, accusing Stephen of violating Jewish law in the name of Jesus. And then the high priest asked Stephen, so, are these charges true? Stephen is young, and he's so bold. What does he say? Well, Stephen is standing before, you have to understand, he's standing before the most credentialed of all contemporary Jewish scholars. And he starts into a history lesson. He's going to teach them a Jewish history lesson. He begins with Abraham, and he talks about him. And then he moves on to Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, these Hebrew iconic figures. And next, he kind of lands on Moses, and he hangs out describing Moses' life for a long time. He knew his audience loved Moses. He moves on to Joshua and then to King David and Solomon. He knew they loved David too. And Stephen delivers this message, this speech that takes up 2 full pages in my Bible. And it's a winsome summary of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's all good, and they're listening until Stephen mentions Jesus. And then Stephen calls his audience stiff-necked people. And he says, your hearts and your ears are not right. You are out of step with God and God's law. And then he calls them murderers and sons of murderers. So he's kind of left the Dale Carnegie, course right there. But with direct language, he challenges them. Let's read what happens. When they heard this, they were furious, and they gnashed their teeth at him. This is not mild irritation. They're not a little upset. They are passionately enraged. But Stephen, full of the Holy Spirit, looked up to heaven and saw the glory of God and Jesus standing at the right hand of God. Look, he said, I see heaven open and the Son of Man, Jesus, standing at the right hand of God. Oh my goodness, that is not what they wanted to hear. And at this, they covered their ears, and yelling at the top of their voices, they all rushed at him. Can you imagine this cluster of black-robed, fuzzy-bearded, crusty geezers? That's who they would have been, rushing Stephen and grabbing him as a mob. And then what do? They take him outside the city. It says they dragged him outside the city, and they began to stone him. Meanwhile, the witnesses laid their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. We'll come back to that. While they were stoning him, Stephen prayed, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. Very similar to something Jesus said from the cross. And then he fell on his knees and he cried out, Lord, do not hold this sin against him. You remember what Jesus said? Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. He's dying just like Jesus. When he had said this, he fell asleep. He died. And Saul was there giving approval to his death. And on that day, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem. The opposition, this rising opposition, seizes the momentum. And there's a shift that takes place on this day. It had been going so well, but there's this shift. And now the momentum moves to the other team. There's a before and an after Stephen's execution. All except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen, and they mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church. going from house to house. He dragged off men and women and put them in prison. He is literally walking into people's homes with the full authority, political and religious authority, to come in, grab them out of their homes, and take them off, drag them off to jail. And he's doing this over and over and over again. This is the pivotal point. Everything was so good. It was great. And then it wasn't. Stephen is executed, this amazing young leader with so much potential, and this incredible church with such an incredible beginning. And it all comes crashing down. At least that's how it felt. The church weeps together over the funeral and the burial of Stephen, and it feels like such a senseless, terrible loss. At that point, the original church had questions for God. And most of us, we raised our hands, and that probably means that we have questions for God. So let's talk. Let's not pretend that everything about following Jesus is unicorns and cotton candy. It's not. Jesus never said that it would be. Jesus said what? He said, in this world you will have trouble. That's what he said. Jesus said, sometimes you should expect death and vultures circling. That's what he said. But there's this human reaction. And I'm owning it's Dan's reaction too. I tend to expect following Jesus to go well. I do. I expect good. Especially when it's been good for a while or even great for a while. Isn't that your expectation too? Don't you kind of expect that? The original church wanted to know, and sometimes Dan wants to know, maybe you want to know, God, what are you doing? Have you ever whispered that question? Or maybe you've yelled it. Maybe you've yelled it out loud. What is God doing right now? I don't understand. It doesn't make sense. This is all bad. This is all loss. When we experience a terrible loss, it is so hard to see what we can see at other times. Usually, we can see that God is faithful, right? We sang it tonight. We can sing that. Everything's cool. On a good day, we can see that God knows what he's doing, and we believe that he can be trusted. But when Stephen's executed, when Bob dies and Jordan doesn't have a dad anymore, when the divorce is final, when the diagnosis is cancer, suddenly it doesn't feel like God is faithful, and it doesn't feel like we can trust him. And if you're in one of those terrible seasons right now, I know it's difficult to receive this. But tonight, here's what I want to say to you. Would you remember that God did not change? He is faithful. He is trustworthy. He loves you. And he is sovereign. Sovereign means that he is king of the universe and that ultimately he is in control. His sovereignty does not mean that the world isn't broken. It does not mean that my sin and other people's sins don't inflict real pain and real loss this side of eternity. It does not mean that we don't have questions, but it does mean that he is still God and I'm not. And the fact that I don't understand, that's just where I'm at. Now, because the death of Stephen happened a long time ago, we're able to look back, and now we can find some answers. We can see what they couldn't see in the original church. Stephen's execution prompted the followers of Jesus to scatter out from the city of Jerusalem to cities and towns all over Judea and Samaria. Jesus had said to his disciples, "You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." But to this point in the original church, they were all still in Jerusalem. They're still hanging out together in the city of Jerusalem. Thousands of people, thousands, benefited from this scattering. And we're going to talk about that more next week. Connected to this scattering, there's a surprising exchange that takes place right there as the rocks are bloodying and breaking Stephen's body. In the story of Christ Church, Stephen exits and goes to heaven. Who enters the scene? Who enters the scene on this day? It's Saul, this person named Saul that's mentioned in the verses that we read. Saul is holding the coats, and he's cheering as the Sanhedrin stones Stephen. Saul is later going to be named Paul, the Apostle Paul. I mean, he doesn't know Jesus yet, but he will. And Stephen's execution begins the story of Paul. Whether you realize it or not, we would never have heard about Jesus. You would not have, I would not have heard about Jesus unless God used Paul to reach out westward toward us. And so there are partial answers to Stephen's death that we can see now, many years later. And sometimes when we experience terrible loss, in time, we find some partial answers, right? But sometimes we don't. I still don't have answers for Bob's death. At least once a month, someone tells me about a terrible loss in their story, and answers remain elusive. What is God doing? Sometimes we just don't know. There's another question that Stephen's story stirs up for me. What is opposition? Acts 7 and 8 describe a rising opposition, a great persecution. It was a tough season for the followers of Jesus. People were dragged out of their homes, thrown into jail for following Jesus. Stephen was executed because he followed Jesus. And there have been seasons in history when opposition to Jesus and those who love him has challenged the church. Actually, right now, something like, and I was struck by this as I did research this week, something like 2 billion followers of Jesus, our brothers and sisters, live in dangerous neighborhoods and hostile contexts tonight. Did you know that every year several thousand Christians are executed for their faith, like Stephen was? Right now, it's tough to follow Jesus if you live in North Korea, Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Sudan, Iran, Pakistan, parts of Nigeria, Liberia, Yemen, parts of India. That's a lot of people, and more. Dura and I have a dear friend who grew up Muslim in Iraq, moved to the States as a young adult, started dating a guy in my church in Orlando, and I got to baptize Amy. Amy would tell you, being a follower of Jesus and being a woman, she would tell you life in Orlando is wonderfully different than life in Iraq. We need to pray for our brothers and sisters who live every day of their lives in danger. And something else, as I was preparing this, it's like I can't skip over this. This is just my opinion. But I believe that we need to stop calling what we face here in the United States persecution. Let's just stop that. Call it disagreement, skepticism, awkwardness, prejudice. Yes, those words probably apply, but not persecution. I believe that cheapens what Stephen and the original church faced. I think that cheapens what 2 billion followers of Jesus face tonight. I believe we can't really imagine what it's like living in the United States. We can't really imagine what it's like to die for our faith. And that's a good thing. We should be grateful that we are gathered tonight, right now. None of us, not a single one of us, is worried about, is someone going to come in those back doors and drag us away because we've been singing songs about Jesus or because we just took communion together? Is anybody worried about that? No, we don't have to even think about that. We shouldn't feel bad about not being persecuted. We shouldn't go out looking for persecution. Instead of dying for our faith, we get to pursue God's calling. What does it mean to live for our faith? Every day, what does following Jesus mean? How can my story connect with his story? There's one more question that Stephen's death prompts for me. What tests, in my life, what tests should I expect? Well, unless we go to other dangerous places to live, persecution isn't a test that we will likely experience. But we should expect that there will be setbacks, disappointments, and given enough time, there will be terrible losses in our lives. Because we live in a broken world. If you've been around Suncrest for even a month, you've probably seen Greg's chart. Creation, brokenness, redemption, and restoration. These phases of the history of mankind. Adam's sin brought weeds, thorns, war, and death. What is more, my sin can hurt you, and your sin can hurt me. And when we sin, we hurt ourselves. And when we sin, we can hurt our kids to the third and the fourth generations, the scriptures tell us. And so I need to expect tests. And in the scriptures, James 1 tells us to consider it pure joy when we get tested. Now, I'm just going to let you know, I'm not there yet. I'm not ready to get all ecstatic when I experience pain. How about you? I'm not to that point yet. But that's something to aspire to. James says, consider it pure joy because the end result when I'm tested is growth. That's how I develop grit. That's how I mature. That's how I get stronger. And God is lovingly supervising, not preventing any of it from happening, but lovingly supervising all of that, calling me to who he made me to be, even when I don't understand or appreciate what he's doing. So here's the bottom line from Stephen's story and from Bob's story. Look at this. When we do life in the Spirit, God uses even our worst losses to tell his beautiful story. When we do life in the Spirit, God uses even our worst losses to tell his beautiful story through our story. He redeems and he uses all of it. Do you fully believe that? Maybe you do. Or maybe this is one of those seasons where it's really tough to trust. 5 decades into life now, and I can tell you I trust God. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a next step for me tonight. I've talked to enough people who have walked through enough losses to know that most of us, including Dan, need to take this next step. If there's something that we lost back when, that may not be totally over for us. What remains in your heart as a secret, subtle resentment toward God? Is there something there? Tonight, would you release it? Would you trust God more? Would you own your resistance to trusting in Him and resting in Him? Would you let your losses finally show you and convince you that all that you have is Jesus and all that you need is Jesus? It'd be a great night tonight if that happened. As Mitch sings, the section hosts are going to come to receive the offering, but this is a moment to reflect and to release and to step into trust.